Breaking news, my dear friends, and new significant explosions have occurred in Moscow. In the center of Moscow, a luxury residential complex is on fire. A penthouse worth over $12 million has caught fire. Explosions in Rostov-on-Don, a shopping mall is ablaze.
That's messed up. This is just insane.
A breakthrough by the Ukrainian armed forces in the Belgorod region. Pro-Russian channels are howling that the Ukrainian armed forces have taken Demidovka and several villages. And the governor has announced a total evacuation.
Hello, dear friends. The situation in the Krasnoarmaysky district remains difficult. Most people, almost everyone, have been evacuated.
The commander of the Leningrad military district of the Russian armed forces, Colonel General Lapin, was killed during the Ukrainian offensive in the Belgorod region. That's what the media are reporting. Of course, this information needs to be verified. Recently, the Ukrainian armed forces struck 2 bridges in the Belgorod region. As a result, Russian logistics are now being disrupted. A Russian Su-25 attack aircraft crashed, and 4 helicopters were destroyed behind enemy lines. For the 6th day in a row, the Kavkazskaya oil pumping station has been burning.
The entire base exploded. Everything is on fire.
Russian public channels report that another storage tank caught fire during the night. Engels too, another detonation at the ammunition depots. We will discuss all of this with the well-known military analyst Roman Tsvetan. Roman Grigorievich, welcome.
Thank you. I wish everyone good health.
Dear audience, please like this video and watch as Moscow burns. Unbelievable, truly. I keep watching and it just gets higher and higher. Oh my God! Roman Grigorievich, what's happening? Where are these explosions in the center of Moscow coming from? A multi-million-dollar penthouse and Rostov-on-Don is burning too, as I understand it, their famous shopping center.
Well, most likely this is already the work of concerned citizens. There is a certain category of people in the world, those who care, who are not indifferent to the suffering of others, real empaths, who eventually find the strength to harm the enemy, our enemy, of course. Each does what they can, depending on their abilities. Someone smoked where they shouldn't have, and a fire started. Someone else actually blew something up to carry out a combat mission. So these very concerned people who genuinely care, if, God forbid, our crucial long-range strikes were to completely stop now, these deeply caring and influential individuals could potentially inflict even more significant and widespread damage on the Russian economy, on Russian domestic production capabilities, and on the Russian political elite, including through various impactful actions. They could in fact do far more profound and lasting harm than any long-range weapons ever could possibly achieve. Let's put our hopes in them. Here, there, and everywhere. Well, it's burning epically, in a truly epic way, although maybe someone just wanted to warm themselves up. Sometimes Russians can burn down a barn too. If the barn's on fire, let the house burn as well, just to get warm. That also serves a certain purpose quite well. We must not forget that there is still quite serious resistance to the political regime in Russia, to the Russian occupation regime, so to speak. It's not clear where exactly they came from, how they ended up on Russian soil, but nevertheless, there is resistance, it will continue. And this resistance is increasing its pressure. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Just as the Putinists put pressure on the Russian people, so the people begin to push back. Moreover, there are several partisan groups operating there, ranging from Maltsev's partisans to those resistance groups in the republics who ultimately see themselves as free without Russian oppression. It's a broad spectrum, and we shouldn't forget the work of our informants, or rather the informants of our intelligence services. We have the Foreign Intelligence Service, the Main Intelligence Directorate, the Security Service Counterintelligence, and also Border Guard Intelligence. In other words, combat missions are being carried out, including with the help of informants on Russian territory. It's the same picture here.
General Lapin was killed during the breakthrough in Belgorod. A huge number of media outlets are reporting this. Roman Grigorievich, should we trust this kind of information? They're writing that the Ukrainian armed forces broke through in Belgorod, several villages have been taken, and now we're destroying logistical bridges. And so, supposedly, General Lapin was killed during the breakthrough by the Ukrainian armed forces in the Belgorod region. What do you think?
Well, it's unlikely that the general was somewhere 3 or 4 kilometers deep in there. You know what I would believe? If he was in one of the helicopters that were hit in the Belgorod direction, then yes, that's possible. That is already in the army's rear, roughly in the army's rear, in one of the helicopters, because there was a Mi-8, two Mi-8s, two Kf-52s. In one of those helicopters, he could definitely have been, or at least nearby at that site, the general could have been there. And in that case, yes, it's technically possible, at least because the helicopter was either an electronic warfare one, well, I mean the Mi-8. It's either for electronic warfare or search and rescue, let's say, or the so-called general carrier. So maybe he was getting a combat award. Well, it could have been hit.
As for the Belgorod region, there's a huge amount of information here. First of all, the governor comes out and talks about evacuations from the region, about breakthroughs. Then Russian war correspondents start saying that the armed forces of Ukraine have made a breakthrough, secured positions in several villages, taken Demidovka, and are now shelling and destroying bridges. In other words, the enemy's logistics. What do you have to say about this? Let's break down this situation. How much of this is information? How much is disinformation? The floor is yours.
Well, the main strategic objective is to create a security zone along the border between Ukraine and Russia. This is our strategic objective after the liberation of Ukraine, to cover the entire Ukrainian-Russian border with a zone about 30 kilometers wide, preferably from the Russian side, since we're not going to mine our own territory. After all, it's our land. We care about our land. And how much does Russia have? 7,000 kilometers of territory. They don't care about it themselves. So the idea is to enter Russian territory, take up the best defensive positions, and create a security zone, just like it was done during the Kursk operation. The only thing is, it ended badly, if you can put it that way. They had to retreat because they held on too long. They should have switched from offensive to defensive mode back in January or February. Now, there's a similar kind of operation underway, not on the same scale, but of the same type, with the creation of a buffer zone. The best defensive positions are being taken up near Demidovka. There are several heights there that will most likely be under the control of our troops. And the fact that bridges are being destroyed actually indicates that the bridgehead we are now going to hold in the Demidovka area, if this is confirmed, and it most likely will be. Why? Because the Russians have been screaming for days on all their channels that they have a big problem there. Somehow the Ukrainians showed up there. They weren't there, and then suddenly out of nowhere they appeared. It's like the fourth dimension, something like that. And the destruction of the bridges means that a security zone is being created around the bridgehead itself. You're right in saying that this is about destroying Russian logistics to make it harder for them to operate against our troops in this direction. At the same time, strikes are being carried out on command posts in the Belgorod direction. Plus, of course, strikes on helicopters.
Roman Grigorievich, regarding these helicopters, the latest information we're analyzing now, how many helicopters have been destroyed? 4?
Yes, 4. 2 Kf-52s and 2 Mi-8s. So this is a single forward operating base, which is why I say that most likely one of the helicopters had an EW system, a so-called electronic warfare system. It provides cover. Sometimes helicopters operate like that. We shot down 2 such Mi-8 helicopters with a Patriot over Klintsy in the Bryansk region, if you remember, on the same day, and Su-34 and Su-35, 2 Mi-8S equipped for electronic warfare, and 1 Mi-8 from the search and rescue service were all taken down. And here it's the exact same situation. So there were 2, a pair of K-52s, those are the so-called attack helicopters, tank destroyers, and 2 Mi-8s. Most likely one was an electronic warfare version and the other could have been a general carrier. And that's just my assumption for now. This is purely an analytical calculation. We'll check that later once we get confirmation. Most likely there was some kind of general carrier there. Le Pen was hanging around. He needed to log a couple of hours near the front line so he could get a combat veteran certificate, maybe even qualify for free housing.
Russian officers, led by General Alexander Lapin, are suspected of carrying out an airstrike on a construction hypermarket in Kharkiv, which resulted in the deaths of 19 civilians.
Well, the thing is, all Russian military personnel are war criminals. And not just war criminals, they're terrorists, outright perpetrators of genocide. Because the entire Ministry of Defense, that's what it really is. The whole structure of the Ministry of Defense is a terrorist organization, or rather a terrorist organization conducting a terrorist operation on Ukrainian soil. And we can see this clearly. These are pure genocidal terrorist strikes. And Putin acts like a terrorist, carrying out these strikes, making demands, killing hostages outright. The terror of the Russian Federation as a state is that it is a sponsor of terrorism because it funds this terrorist organization, the Ministry of Defense. Why? Because the Ministry of Defense is funded from the Russian budget. because this creates an interesting tandem, at the very least, between the terrorist organization, the Ministry of Defense, and the Russian Federation as a state sponsor of terrorism. Naturally, any Russian serviceman who is part of the Russian Ministry of Defense is a terrorist and, of course, is subject to elimination. Here, even without trial or investigation, mere membership in a terrorist organization essentially removes them from under investigation and places them directly under actionable measures with a provable basis. And then the mode switches to the liquidation operation has been launched. Naturally, they will be tracked wherever they are and eliminated. At first, of course, they'll go after the big shots, meaning the top leaders. And then in 15 or 20 years, the tentacles of our GUR, our counterintelligence, our security service will reach every participant in the invasion of Ukraine, everyone who was involved in the terror and genocide of the Ukrainian people.
Roman Grigorievich, according to the latest information from Russian public channels, a Russian Su-25 attack aircraft has crashed. What do you know about this? Because they're saying it was due to engine failure.
Well, it's an old plane. It even fought in Afghanistan back in the 70s. Well, actually in the 80s. So it's an old plane, the engines and the airframe, it's sturdy, well built. It's an excellent machine, truly an excellent machine, but it's been flying for 50 years, or well, 40 to 50 years, and it's bound to start falling apart. They fall apart in the air, especially since Russia has problems with the engines. First of all, the Russians are under serious sanctions. Of course, these are old Soviet engines, but still, nevertheless, there are issues with maintenance. That's why I think this is the real reason why the Su-25 crashed.
Roman Grigorievich, in our previous program, which got nearly 1 million views, thanks to our audience for that, we discussed Engels 2 and the strikes. There was footage of ammunition depots detonating literally today. So what is known at this point about this strike on Engels? The floor is yours.
Well, the security services and special operations forces were involved. It was a well-executed attack. As a pilot, I can say, well done. That is, most likely there are pilots involved there as well. The way aviators would have planned this attack is exactly how it was carried out. There were several waves, there were jamming devices, there were decoy drones, and drones with heavy weaponry came in. Most likely, maybe even a missile got through because there was a serious breach. That means the warhead was about 150 kilograms. We have such missiles. With that range, they can reach the target. In other words, it was a well-prepared attack by the security services, and credit should be given to them. When our guys undertake an operation to destroy something behind enemy lines, they execute it thoroughly. Plus, special operations forces were involved, and of course, the Ukrainian defense forces also took part. That is, our unmanned systems participated in this operation as well. The strike was delivered precisely on the CSU, the so-called Special Engineering Service. This is the area where they unloaded the 76th unit, unloaded the missiles, and then the engineers began preparing them for launch. And this preparation, this table, so to speak, with embankments, of course, and all the protective measures, but the large number, most likely, of drones in the wave made it possible to cover almost everything. And confirmation already came from an objective control tool that was used, satellite images, which clearly showed serious craters in the places where the missiles were unloaded and the combat mission was carried out. Plus, most likely, I think the drones even reached Saratov 63. A little further south, literally just a few dozen kilometers south of Engels, on the left bank of the Volga, there is a military unit. If I remember correctly, if my memory serves me right, it's 25623. Something like that. I might be mixing up the numbers. This is what's called Saratov 63. It's a storage facility for tactical and strategic nuclear weapons, and drones could have reached there. That's the general direction. Why am I mentioning this? There is information from the area about increased radiation levels, specifically in that section on the left bank. So I think there was a real large-scale attack, or not ruling out the possibility that, for example, in the area of this strategic base, in the area of the pretrial detention center, there were also nuclear warheads present, and that they could be affected by this explosion. Obviously, there won't be a nuclear explosion, because for a nuclear bomb to actually detonate like a nuclear explosion, a lot of conditions have to be met. It's practically impossible. But some components, when they explode, do cause contamination with isotopes. And now it's being confirmed that there is serious isotope contamination there, specifically from nuclear warheads. Let's wait for confirmation, because for now, this information is circulating only among insiders, so to speak. But nevertheless, such information is starting to surface now.
My audience, literally the day after our stream, sent me a message, quote, Engels, the radiation levels have risen.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about. How is this even possible? I just have a lot of friends who are pilots. Back when we were studying, I entered the Chernyakovsk flight school in 1981 and graduated in 1985. There were more than 200 people just in our class. There were over 100 people in a company, and 2 companies graduated, the 4th and the 7th. So we had more than 200 people. We still keep in touch, at least by writing, and by now everyone has long since retired. Some are in the reserves, but for the most part, like me, they're retired after 60. So there is information that indeed, because there are contacts, there is information that after that strike, the radiation levels really did rise. So most likely the Russians messed something up with the radiation somewhere. What I mean is specifically the nuclear stockpiles, the nuclear warheads. Either they were already being stored not only at Saratov 63, but also including in the Engels area. Or our drones managed to reach Engels. The Russians are simply keeping quiet about this strike.
Which in principle is typical for them. Roman Grigorievich.
Not to Engels, sorry, to Saratov 63. Yes, I misspoke a bit. To that nuclear storage facility near Engels, Saratov 63.
Dear audience, write in the comments what you think about this. Like this video, and also let us know where you're watching from. Where are you watching us from? Roman Grigorievich, for the 6th day in a row, the Kavkazskaya oil pumping station in the Krasnodar region of Russia has been burning. Again last night, on the night of March 24th, another storage tank caught fire. What do you have to say about this?
Well, we need to understand what kind of station this is. It's a blending station. Railway tank cars would come there and unload oil or waste from the Russian oil industry, and then these Russian wastes would be pumped into the Trans-Caspian Corporation's pipeline. And that's a Kazakh corporation. So the Kazakhs were actively pumping their valuable Kazakh oil through this extensive pipeline system. It inherently possesses a slightly higher sulfur content, but nevertheless, it is still perfectly clean enough for the intricate refining processes. And in Novorossiysk, they loaded Kazakh oil onto tankers through this pipeline. Meanwhile, the Russians operating through this particular station were actively pumping out approximately 6 million tons of this Russian junk or refuse per year on an ongoing basis. In other words, they were blending it, so to speak, and selling it as well, including, of course, reporting certain funding and naturally receiving it as well. And so there were always, from time to time, remarks about Kazakh oil. Sometimes there were negative comments about it, trying to lower its rating at the very least. But that's actually this Russian blend. So that's why a specific strike was carried out on this station. The strike was, I would say, a triple one. Quite interesting. First of all, I don't think there will be any further complaints about Kazakh oil. That's one. And second, the Russians won't know what to do with their oil waste anymore because they have to get rid of it somewhere. They were really trying to pump in junk there. Well, naturally, they won't be getting money for those 6 million tons of oil per year. This is quite a serious blow to the Russians. Well, I think the Kazakhs will thank us, although right now they're doing well. They understand that it's not worth dealing with the Russians for the next few decades. Now they're starting to lay a pipeline along the Caspian route, meaning directly through the Caspian Sea, along the bottom of the Caspian Sea. That would be the optimal option for the Kazakhs.
The Roman Grigorievich, the Sudzha gas metering station continues to burn in the Kursk region. This is being reported by Kremlin propagandist media. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine stated in advance that the Russians had repeatedly attacked the gas metering station, constantly blaming the Ukrainian side for what was happening, adding that Moscow itself struck the Sudzha station in order to accuse Kyiv of shelling. What do you think?
Well, if I had the chance, I would have blown it up along with the pipeline 10 years ago. No, seriously, why? Because Russian gas is pumped in one direction, and in the other direction, the Russian treasury receives money. A lot of money, billions of dollars. They get around $5 billion a year. Roughly, in recent years, they've been pumping about 15 billion cubic meters of gas. That's about 4 to 5 billion. How do you calculate it? Those are pretty significant, serious numbers. Plus, there's another pipeline nearby, just north of us. We've mentioned it before, the Druzhba oil pipeline. There, they pump 300,000 barrels of oil per day. That's about $18 million a day going to the Russian treasury. And this pipeline brings in more than $6.5 billion a year. So there you have it, 2 pipelines. And the Russian treasury was receiving over $10 billion, selling and transporting oil even through Ukraine. The Druzhba oil pipeline, for example, goes through Unecha and then enters Belarus via Novozibkov. It also supplies the Moser oil refinery from which the Russians get diesel, jet fuel and gasoline for Moscow and the Moscow region, by the way. Plus, part of the pipeline is diverted through Ukraine. We pump Russian oil to the Hungarians, not to our own guy, the smart fellow who flies around, but to the Hungarians, meaning Orban's people. So we're pumping all of this ourselves. In other words, we're practically creating a financial cushion for the Russians ourselves. That's why I say they should have been destroyed back in 2014. Why did they stand there for 10 years and no one blew it up? That's a big question. Why didn't Syrskyi give the order as soon as they moved in September, as soon as they entered Sudza, to blow up that station? That's another question. But it's not really up to Syrskyi. We understand perfectly well that he gets his orders from the politicians. So either he was given a different order or he wasn't specifically told to do this. Why they didn't blow it up during the retreat is also a big question. This refers both to Syrskyi and to the politicians who didn't allow it to be done. But the Russians started to finish it off, most likely, first of all, because they're probably listening to us, since we've repeatedly said that Sudza needs to be blown up. Most likely, there are some fans of Colonel Sviatan among the Russian generals, and in the end, they blew up that Sudza. And then the Russian information operations guys got involved to pin it on us after the retreat, as they say. The third question is this. We've already covered the first and second points. Where is the gas coming from? That Sudza pipeline is still burning to this day. Where is the gas coming from? Who was pumping gas there? So what does that mean? Does that mean gas was still being pumped? We were told a fairy tale by the Green Office that all supplies had already been cut off, that from January 1st, no one was pumping anything. Everything was gone. So what exactly is gone? It's already March and there's still gas there and it's still burning. So why were they feeding us lies? In other words, there are a lot of questions for our politicians. I think that someday counterintelligence investigators will be asking them these questions, and then we'll tell everyone about it. Who did what, where, for how much, and what they pocketed by pumping gas through that pipeline.
Roman Grigorievich, now let's talk about military losses in the Russian army. So military expert and ultra-patriot Maxim Klimov stated, and I quote, "We're already tired of washing body bags." He said that the losses in the Russian army are so enormous that there aren't enough body bags for the dead, and they have to wash and reuse the same bags several times. But of course, Solovyov won't mention any of this on his show. They supposedly have no losses at all. Everything is just fine for them. How dire is the situation in the Russian army today, really?
Well, we could give them a suggestion. Well, just get them from the Chinese after all. They could easily churn out as many disposable ones as needed for such a cause. As I see it, the Chinese could probably whip up 1 million of them. They'd be more than happy to accept payment for this whole affair. I'll go even further. We could even pay for it ourselves. Why not? We'll take part in the process of disposing of the Russian army, destroy them on the front line, and immediately pay for, well, of course, I'm being sarcastic here, pay for the bags for the Russian units of the Russian army, or whatever you want to call them. What they do with that is their problem. And the loss is really a significant. Every day, over 1,000 Russians are taken off the battlefield. Why is it important for Putin right now, say in about a month, to request an operational pause or do everything possible to stop the fighting? He needs to get about 20 to 25% of his personnel back into action. The Russians are bringing in, last year, they were bringing in about more than 1,000 to 1,100 Russians per day to the so-called recruitment centers. They don't have TCCs, they still have military commissariats. That's about how it is. More than 1,000 were coming in. Why more than 1,000? Basically, it's not a problem. Russia has 1,120 cities. So if at least one person comes in per day from each city, that's 1,000 across all of Russia. 1,100 Russian federals who are becoming very, it's just that we're subtracting them now quite seriously. More than 1,000 are being subtracted. And already this year, the number has dropped by about 1.5 to 2 times, probably 600, 700. Well, our main directorate at least has confirmed this number several times. So a reduction of 500 is the minimum. And of course, if we're reducing by more than 1,000, then this negative balance starts to accumulate. And this accumulation of losses naturally will force Putin to request an operational pause in order to bring enough, well, additional troops into action. So in about a month, expect to hear Russia lamenting that they already want to stop.
Roman Grigorievich, regarding the peacekeeping contingent and troops on the territory of Ukraine, right now, everyone is writing that Gerstamer, who was the ideologist behind this idea, is now being somewhat held back by the British Army, as they are not satisfied with the presence of the British Army specifically on Ukrainian territory. They fear a retaliatory reaction from Russia, and so, as they say, it's one step forward, two steps back. So perhaps, for example, NATO countries' air forces, yes, but not ground troops. Why do you think that today all the media are writing that the armies of these very countries? I think there are questions in France as well. But for some reason, it's the United Kingdom that is the most reluctant to be present on Ukrainian territory. What are the global media writing about?
Well, you have to understand what kind of tasks each branch and type of troops would be brought in for. For example, let's say peacekeeping tasks. With such a task, then following UN recommendations, you could enter, but that's unrealistic. Why? Because until we reach the border of our state, no one is going to stop. It's unrealistic. All this talk about various halts, it's all utter nonsense. It's impossible to stop an army of 1.5 million or two armies of 700,000 each, practically 1.5 million on both sides across a 1,500-kilometer wide front. It's simply unrealistic to stop that. So there's no point at all in even discussing topics related to peacekeepers. Naturally, right now, any attempt to enter under the guise of peacekeepers will come under fire from both sides. Interestingly enough, who's going to pay attention to whether they're peacekeepers or not? Whether their helmet is blue or not? Well, whether it's a blue helmet or not, no one is even paying attention to that anymore. So at the very least, that option is already off the table. The second issue is aviation. Now, this is a positive task, one that, for example, the French and the British could carry out even within the framework of the Budapest Memorandum. After all, they are signatories to the Budapest Memorandum. The British are direct signatories, and the French, along with the Chinese, joined the memorandum later. Within the framework of this so-called protocol, they can cover our skies. For example, the French could be stationed in Romania. They already have bases deployed there, and the British have bases in Poland as well. So at the very least, they could protect our skies from somewhere around the Dnipro and westward, and there would be nothing particularly dangerous about that. The most interesting thing from a safety perspective, why won't your 300-kilometer zone allow Russian air defenses to reach these aircraft? They can take out virtually all aerial targets. So the same Shaheds, the same missiles can be dealt with in this mode. And by the way, we'll be able to move our air defense missile systems from the right bank to the left, increasing the density of our air defenses on the left bank. And then you could say we'll be covered in a non-dangerous mode. This kind of aviation mode is the most optimal option. Carrying out the mission on the ground, a combat mission, well, it's still being carried out. The thing is, we currently have a sufficient number of servicemen from European armies who have retired and are now fighting against the Russians. Within the armed forces of Ukraine, we have an international legion, which already numbers not just a few thousand, but even tens of thousands of people who have joined and are carrying out combat missions in all branches and types of Ukrainian forces. But for example, deploying ground units or setting up garrisons during active combat operations would basically mean putting them directly in the path of Russian ballistic missiles. So there is a certain logic to this. In other words, from this perspective, at least for us, there is an understanding of why there is resistance. So it's not that simple. So things have to be done a bit differently in that case. Most likely that's exactly the issue being raised here. If you want to deploy a significant ground mission with ground troops operating in a combat zone, then you will absolutely have to provide them with adequate air cover as well, ensuring their safety and operational effectiveness. So yes, for example, just speaking very roughly, let's say a significant British regiment or an entire brigade lands in Giuliani, or perhaps somewhere in Borispil, or even further afield in Zhytomyr. Then first they would have to bring in Patriots or SAMPTs to provide air cover, and also, for example, bring in either NASAMs or IRIS-T for additional cover, as well as Gepards. In other words, it's an entire process of securing the area from all sides so that the deployment site, the so-called permanent deployment point, is completely protected. Why? Because the Russians would immediately start striking it. That's all there is to it. So this question comes up right away. You can't just say, let's throw a British brigade into some sector. That's not how it's done. And this isn't about opposition. It's about raising questions regarding the technical support for a ground mission.
Dear audience, please like this video and subscribe to my channel, Dasha Shasliva. Thank you so much. In the comments, let me know where you're watching from and what you think about the situation overall. Every like and every comment from you is very valuable because we work for an audience all over the world so that they know the truth about Russian aggression. The well-known military analyst Roman Svitan. Roman Grigorievich, thank you. And as usual, see you this Thursday.
Goodbye.